So my name is Julie Lawson, and I'm the lead author of the report Housing 2030. So Housing 2030 is the UN's report on affordable housing. It's, if you like, I guess one of the go-to books that are out there. It was developed over in recent years. It was published by the United Nations and launched in Geneva in 2021. So at that time, that report, which covers land policy, finance, circuits of investments in housing, the governance of those who play a role in the housing system, and also in decarbonising homes and environmental sustainability. So that report was put to the 56 ministers in Geneva, and with great celebration, because there was a lot of collective work involved. But a few weeks later, of course, in February, the escalation of the war in Ukraine. And the thought amongst the authors of that report were really we should be using whatever best practices and networks, especially amongst peer policymakers, researchers across Europe, to be put to use where possible for Ukraine. So we actually wrote at that time to the European Investment Bank, whose responsibility has for actually investing in affordable, adequate green housing for those for which the market is not responding. And of course, they have, in fact, a framework policy of which guides them what they should be doing. So our first attempt was to use the institutions out there in Europe to do what they're there to do. However, of course, they don't act unless they feel that they can do so and that the governance arrangements there are adequate to be able to receive that investment. So we didn't get very far with the EIB in those first few months. But of course, it put the spotlight on what will be the arrangements through which investment could help to rebuild the homes or to repair or to build new where needed, where people prefer to live or relocate. So that was going to take time. So I'm pleased, though, in that period, the European peers and others didn't stand still. And with the help in the Netherlands, for example, was an event which, together with Ukrainians based in Ukraine, but also here in the Netherlands, came together to sort of structure an agenda for what would be relevant and interesting for Ukraine to hear about. That was held in February 16 in 2023 and hosted by the National Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL. Probably heard of PBL. That's a very important body for planning and the living environment and talking about homes and neighbourhoods, etc. So what was great is that largely we had young Ukrainian researchers on the steering team advising and helping organise the agenda for that. One of them's in the room. Sasha had a key role to play in that. So together we were able to combine who was out there, which we knew of in recent times with Housing 2030, also with the Dutch, but also using, if you like, the gravitas of PBL to attract the decision makers that would have an influence over thinking about rebuilding homes in the future. So we were able to attract the EIB to the table finally, the European Commission, the World Bank, the Council of Europe Bank, the IFC, the IMF, all spoke also alongside young Ukrainian researchers who were able to put forward their research understanding of the situation of the housing system in Ukraine and all its faults and all its prospects. So that was a very important event, and that led to a report being written called Rebuilding a Place to Call Home. And in between that event and the writing of that report, the Ukrainian researchers did a lot of further digging. So they really pursued the contributions made by Finland, for example, by Austria, by Denmark, and by the Netherlands to really pull apart what were the mechanisms that were utilised in those countries to be able to build reasonably well and accommodate, in particular, affordable, accessible housing for those who may not be able to or be wanting to take on a mortgage or whatever in the new Ukraine. So we haven't stopped since that report, and we've basically been working together as an informal, active group. And this is largely what informs the presentation that I'm going to be making. So I'd like to give particular thanks to social policy think tank SADOS, based in Ukraine, to New Housing Policy, which is a group of housing researchers in Ukraine, and also UNUM, which has really been the birthplace of so many good things around urban responses and good urban planning, good design, and trying to really lift the capacities and attention for these things. So together, these networks have been incredibly useful and important. And I have to say, at the end of the day, will be influential. And I'll show you how, and show you that the words of these things have come back also in the Ukraine plan, which was launched this week through the Parliament on Monday. So, as everybody knows, the war has been a war on civilians. It's a war that's affected people's homes, people's living environments, and the damage is enormous, and it's happening every day. We know even this morning how impactful that has been, hitting many cities across Ukraine, hitting buildings where people are sleeping at night, and causing enormous human impact. In fact, when we talk about the financial side of the impact, it's actually housing and the urban home environment which is the most impacted, the largest proportion of what the World Bank's damage and needs assessment has shown. So I don't know if you're aware, but there are some key reports which attempt to quantify, the physical damage. Of course, nothing can quantify the human cost, but they try to say what the damage to what sectors, and it's housing, which is actually the largest sector. As the most recent report, there's been 3 of these big reports, was released on February 15, and you see in that report, this is an image from it, that of the entire damage, around 52 billion is to the housing sector. Remember that figure. So, of course, that's had an enormous impact, not just on people's homes, but also on population movement. So you can imagine in people moving from the impacted areas you saw in that map from the east to the west. So, of course, you have different impacts in housing. So in Lviv, of course, we've got an enormously under pressure housing market. We've got people now who've been living there in containers for up to 8 years, actually 10 years. In Lviv, there are containers which were given by the German government in 2014. Interestingly, as an aside, when Merkel, when she was in power, came to visit Germany and she saw those containers, she said, "Why are they still using those containers? Haven't they worked out a system to properly accommodate people in quality homes yet?" So at that point, a small budget was allocated to the International Organization of Migration to pilot different municipal housing responses. They started in Luhansk and Donetsk, and in fact that was also one of the presentations that was given in The Hague, because their story is quite interesting and could help us. Of course, when the aggression escalated, they moved across to the western side of the country, and now they've expanded a program with about 12 mayors, and they're making concepts with them about what kind of housing response is appropriate for their communities. So also something interesting to keep an eye on. But what's really important to know is that the people who have moved from one side to the other, many of them actually are not now home owners. They are renters. So the question is about their wanting to either go back or to be resettled in another place or to settle where they now are. They are partly a dynamic population with different connections and wishes for their future. but they're also people whom their resources have been run down. So their savings have been consumed, and much of that consumption has benefited those who are renting the dwellings of which they're living in. So Ukraine has a notoriously unregulated rental market. And even though across Europe during COVID, we were all concerned about the plight of people living in rental housing. I don't know if you followed that debate, but there was a lot of concern to prevent evictions, for example, during COVID. There hasn't been a similar level of concern for renters in Ukraine. It's been vocalised, and there are activists concerned about it, but the government hasn't chosen to sort out problems there effectively. They could choose, there is a number of mechanisms they could choose to, for example, give greater protection, some security, some quality, some also cap on rent increases. But as we know now in Lviv, for example, rents have escalated by over 140%, and there's a lot of exploitation going on, milking unfortunate and powerless people who have moved into accommodation. So 38% of these IDPs are really struggling with paying their rent and have exhausted their savings. And the question is, are the solutions which are being offered to the housing system reform by the influential actors, are they actually solving that problem at its root, as has been mentioned already by a member in the audience? So therefore, we need to think about the housing system not just in terms of its physical attributes and qualities, which are lacking, but also in terms of its the service that it offers. So the security, the affordability as well, very, very important. We know now, since the latest estimates from the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, that's really now the only organisation which is surveying the displaced population. It has a method by which it does that every quarter, and survey posts, and where it asks people the situation, adequacy, etc. So they're a key organisation in collecting data as well. So we know that of the displaced community, as I mentioned, they are primarily renting, but there's also another side to the story, which is that the typical Ukrainian family since the 1990s and 2000s is a homeowner. In fact, a rather sudden homeowner. In fact, many of them were even given their homes, and it was not. It was a very rapid process, and often, if you can imagine, a large building which is 30 to 50 years old, suddenly having maybe 300 different owners, of varying economic capacity, without perhaps a experience in managing a building, without being formally responsible for managing that building or maintaining it or looking after the spaces in between, the corridor, the staircase, the garden around. You can imagine that perhaps within 20, 30 years, without a really effective legal framework to support the improvement and the genuine improvement, like substantial improvement, of some of those fairly modest dwellings, they're not going to be in good situation. So many of those dwellings, even after 20, 30 years, 40% of them still have never been renovated, 40% since they were built. So they were built, to a certain standard at the time, but they are also very energy inefficient buildings. They're very modest in size, and the space per person is actually relatively low in the European average. So those leaky, modest buildings, with not always economically strong owners, are also needing assistance. There's another side to the equation which is interesting, which is energy subsidies. So when I pay for my energy of a leaky building, it could be really expensive. especially with gas prices or prices of energy going through the roof. But there are subsidies available in Ukraine, and they're paid by the local government. So there's a huge drain on local resources to pay these subsidies. So if those buildings were in good order, there'd be money for other things, like money to improve the kindergartens, money to improve the local park. But instead, it's going to the energy company. So work that one out. We can. It was created, it can be uncreated. So it's a situation where we've stepped back and not really had effective ways of managing these buildings, and that's a problem. And again, in the rental sector. And thirdly, unlike other countries in Europe, where there are a range of types of landlords, some of them are, if you like, public purpose or public mission. They might be cooperatives, they might be housing associations like the Woningbouwcorporaties in Nederland. They might be student housing providers, they might be municipal housing companies. There's none of that. Well, there's 0.8% of the housing system, the housing stock in Ukraine is provided that way. So there isn't a sufficient weight of, if you like, those kind of public purpose, public interest landlords, which you see in a more dominant presence in, if you like, the countries with the good housing systems, where people do have access to affordable housing, where students are looked after better, where there is more security. So you see those kind of landlords do exist in Germany, Denmark, Finland, Austria, and in some cities in very dominant form. Vienna is the big poster child for, they're all mainly private entities actually in Vienna, but they have to operate according to a set of rules and guidelines and have a culture and a mission to provide the best quality of homes for the best price. That's the cost rent recovery limit profit scheme they have there, which is now, of course, become world famous. So I've got a picture there of the third report. It's a very minimal cover, but that was the cover of the most recent report. And in there is useful information collected at the very brigade level by members of the military who actually observe the damage. And that's aggregated all the way up to be this damage report, and then correlated with GIS and satellites and all that sort of stuff. There's a methodology in there which the GIS people, if they're in the room, probably like to get into, but it's not my field. So, okay, knowing what we know about the housing system, what sort of assistance or responses are being made? Well, at the moment in Ukraine, there is assistance to landlords to accommodate displaced people as a small amount to cover utility costs and so on. And there is mortgage subsidies to banks to give cheap loans to households. There's a program which currently, for example, offers 3% or 7% interest mortgages to eligible, approved applications. So the applications, last time I looked, were around 184,000, and 1,200 had been allocated. And who had they been allocated to? Of course, people who could pay that mortgage, even though it's 3 or 7%. They could pay that, and who were they? Largely non-operative soldiers who were living in the Kiev region. So the question is, there are also emerging vouchers to owners of damaged properties. That's a program called ABBA, and that is providing assistance to those who have registered their ownership since 2013. So I don't know if any of you are homeowners, but usually you do that kind of thing once. So if you've bought or sold your dwelling after 2013, it would appear somewhere in the registry. It has to be registered, and you have to be registered as an owner. You have to have not received any assistance from any other international program, and you go into a database, and I believe that's now, I had the figures of how many, it's in the hundreds of thousands of people who applied. I think 445,000 people have applied for this assistance, but the number of certificates that have been paid out is in the tens of thousands, so relatively small. So that's, of course, if you're an owner of a damaged property and you've applied and you are registered after XYZ. So that's the main forms of assistance that's going on at the moment. For the displaced renter, it's a rather different story, and it's relatively limited, mainly through donations from international donors, from charities or from other philanthropic activities, often temporary shelters. And when I mean temporary, I mean temporary. So you can be told now, I think they've changed the rules recently, you have 2 weeks and then you're out. If you're in, that's how temporary it can be. You are told if they need to use that gym for something else or that school for something else. Of course, it had a former purpose. Then you can sit down and you can be moved on. But as I said, also there are container dwellings which people have also lived in for now up to 10 years in Lviv. I mentioned also the number of pilots that are being tested here and there, and there's a film which has been made by a very courageous and curious architect in Lviv. Her name is Natalia Misak, and she has produced a documentary which she goes to all these different types of initiatives, from hands-on repair through to someone hiring a hotel and accommodating displaced older women to set up a sort of aged care situation. And at the end of the documentary, she meets with Sakina, who's the deputy minister, and asks for her response and what will her response will be, in which she has this gold brick, which she says, "This is our hope." Has this sort of mirage of marketing in a sense. So how real is the Ukraine government's efforts towards reconstruction and recovery in the field of affordable rental housing? And the metal is hitting the road, so to speak, right now, because of course the European facility and the negotiations of the Ukrainian plan has in fact forced their hand to have a recovery that leaves no one behind. And I'll talk to you a bit more soon about that. So out, of course, in Europe, the whole social and affordable housing scene is very much in the European discussion, debate, when people are talking about affordable housing, where am I going to live, the future for young people, the situation in major cities in particular. And there's been a number of reports that have been coming out since 2000 which are stressing the needs for much more careful design of and influence of markets. So rather than a sort of enabling strategy and allowing credit to flow to whatever kinds of residential real estate that is absorbed out there, that perhaps we need to be a little bit more careful with all the policy levers that we do have and to shape a market to deliver the housing we need. Also for future generations in an environment which is not going to exhaust the finite resources that we have on the planet we live in. So we see the OECD coming out with a series of reports. One of them is called Brick by Brick, another one here, Social Housing, a Key Part of Past and Future Housing Policy. The Housing 2030 report, which of course yours truly was involved in, but many, many others. We had involved 1,200 policy experts, a huge effort over 2 years to pull that report together. That report informed also the Housing Policy Working Group of the Lugano Plan. Do you remember the Lugano Plan? So that was the first attempt in 2022 for Ukraine to put out the directions of reconstruction that was held in Lugano. And this blue-covered report here is the one of the thematic reports that was prepared for that. So how did that work? There was 23 working groups. One of them was on housing policy. It met twice a week for 6 weeks. It involved 30 different people, All of them were Ukrainian, except 3 or 4 international experts. It was all conducted in Ukrainian, which was pretty amazing for the international experts who were sort of struggling to keep up with track changes and versions and, you know, in the chat and the side and to provide something useful. And anyway, that ended up being this report here, the blue one, and in there you can see it starts to line out some ambitions towards what reforms it wants to make in the form of affordable rental housing and urban planning and energy efficient neighbourhoods on renewable energy. There's all sorts of hopes and aspirations in there, and a timetable and so on. But that never went to Parliament. It went to Lugano. It didn't go to Parliament, which is a pity. So also, I draw your attention to a report called The State of Housing in Europe 2023, and that's done by an organisation called Housing Europe. Housing Europe is a sort of federation of all those mission-focused providers, you know, the cooperatives, etc. And it's been in there all the time, also trying to educate the Commission that it should be drawing on some of the good ideas in Europe for how Europe recovered and the role of, if you like, a more mission-focused housing system which uses land policy and uses other instruments, especially channeling of investment towards homes that are needed and governed in a way which is not only respectful of the people who live there, but socially inclusive, energy efficient, and there for future generations. So I won't go into details too much about these things because it's probably not your cup of tea, but in the absence of research being done from that needs assessment of the World Bank to the absence of investment, we as researchers from RMIT, University of Sydney, New South Wales and the Ukrainian team from New Housing Policy tried to take the data that was there, the International Organisation of Migration data, which surveyed the needs of IDPs and asked them, you know, what are the barriers to you finding a secure, stable home? What is your situation, your income, etc., your household size? Where do you want to be? Do you want to be here, somewhere else, back home? So we took that data and did a needs assessment of what, from the point of view of what could people afford to pay, and rather than it being a finance first, which would ask what would we need people to pay to make the project work, we asked it the other way around. So this is the group, what could they afford that would allow them to have a life after housing costs, if you like, and what's the gap between what it takes to provide a reasonable, decent dwelling, a la modest improvement on Ukraine situation in the market situation where they want to go. So it's quite a massive statistical exercise, you can imagine. So we had a team with people who were demographers who could take that data and spatially work it out. We had a team of project development costing, and also embedded in the cost, construction, land costs, and operating and tax settings and business settings in Ukraine to work out, okay, what is the cost of the dwellings and what is the gap after which needs to be paid after the revenue from the residents themselves. So we were able to work out, you know, what size of program are we talking about across the country for this particular group. So of course, this is just a mental exercise. You know, and I don't mean to say it's a fiction, but it's a demonstration to say to those who are funding the recovery to get more real, you know, to understand the spatial differences, the budget of the people involved, where they want to be to afford decent housing. So we were able to do that, which of course was a great surprise to the World Bank, and a great surprise to the Minister of Regions, to which this work has also been presented. We were also able to show that different policies have a different impact on the cost of any program. So one of the biggest impacts is the land costs. So depending on the cost of the land, etc. But of course, there are choices in how those costs are determined, or how those values are determined, and also the arrangements under which that land would sit in the project, if it would be, for example, leased, or it would be co-equity. So it was clear from the use of different levers and different types of financing instruments, it will have a different impact on the cost of a program of affordable rental, up to a significant 181% difference in the cost to government of supporting any kind of program. So in looking at what national governments could do, typically national governments have a role in setting the direction, the long-term direction of a housing strategy. They usually have a responsible nominated minister or an agency involved. They also utilise their power in public financing to ensure, by guarantees or by co-financing or by channeling investment from external donors to projects or proposals that are needed or in regions which are most affected. And also they have a role in monitoring the allocation of that public investment if made, and the operational efficacy and of those entities which are receiving that support. You know how it works in the Netherlands and in Austria and in Vienna in particular, and in Finland and so on. So, of course, many of those things don't exist in Ukraine, and so it has been recommended to Ukraine over actually many, many years, even since 2008. There have been reports from the UN Economic Commission for Europe actually asking for these reforms to be made. The most interesting report on that was 2013. So there's been a long period of lack of action, in fact, also of withdrawal of action. No longer needs are monitored, no longer statistics are collected, you know, no longer programs that did exist are funded. So, of course, local governments are now, under the whole decentralisation paradigm in Ukraine, have been given the constitutional responsibility for housing delivery, for housing policy, for housing, social housing. And of course, they have particularly strong roles in land use planning, but they also have roles in potentially conditional equity, because they have significantly increased taxation, revenue, resource sharing roles these days. So they have greater capacities than in the past. And they also could take on, as in the city of Helsinki, for example, the establishment of a municipal housing company, or at least provide space for cooperatives and other non-commercial entities to be able to play a role in the housing system. So all of this requires Ukraine to get serious about its vision, to work together with municipalities in a meaningful way, and also to be able to channel investment and resources to the areas which are needed. So that's where efforts have been made to influence the Ukrainian government to work in partnership with them, and also to draw on lessons from Europe. So when the event in The Hague was held, we had, as I mentioned, experts from Denmark, from the Netherlands, from Vienna, from Finland and Austria, of which led to that report around a national framework, national governance and funding, municipal mandate, upgrading tenancy rights, also in working on housing stock management reform, which may also mean changes to the condominium laws around voluntary contributions might be made mandatory, the entities themselves might be made legally stronger. There are best practices around that could be drawn on to improve that, and to be able to put those building owners in a position where they could attract funds to renovate effectively and take on the risk of a longer term investment improving their properties. And of course, in strategic land use planning, which is one of the most influential tools that could be used to influence the reconstruction of towns and expansion or reformulation, readjustment of shrinking cities, those which will have different economies, different labour force arrangements and different visions for their future. So land policy and the instruments of land policy. So we've got one urban planner in the room. So things like land banking, land acquisition, readjustment and reorganisation of the land, land leasing on a conditional basis, just like in Rotterdam or Amsterdam or Canberra, to influence what is actually built, and also for revenues from the lease back to pour back into the city over generations. Did you know that a law around land leasing and land acquisition in Finland, when they had to accommodate 250,000 people from the annexed territory and readjustment, they had a period of chaos in Helsinki and overcrowding and very bad housing conditions that also come from overcrowding. So the law was changed in 1947, whereby the city could acquire farmland and brownfields and so on, and at I won't say a friendly price, but a fair and negotiated price agreement. They now lease that land for the purposes of different segments of the housing market. They receive revenues around 450 million per year. Those revenues are able to go into programs to provide social services, kindergartens, you name it. But that is why Finland is what it is. It's why, the happy country is able to deliver the level and standard of living that it does, because of the way in which they recycle the benefits for the community. So last but not least, on land policy, you've got land value capture from intense uses, and of course the zoning and the way in which that's used. So we know in the Netherlands it uses all those instruments and it's used all of them to produce the kind of cities that it has, that it produced also in the post-war reconstruction, through to the Vinex, and perhaps we can see what happens when you don't use those instruments anymore, and that it causes also problems in supply and delivery and who's served by the market. So another workshop was held almost a year later. People were getting impatient, not only the Ukrainians. And so this workshop was initiated by Ukraine in Lviv. In fact, there was a second Rebuilding a Place to Call Home, which took place in November. At that event, where I was as well, fortunately the European Investment Bank was watching from a distance, and they said, come to Vienna and we'll bring all the ministers, we'll bring 12 cities, we'll bring those who've been piloting housing programs, those who are implementing them effectively in their country, we'll bring them together in Vienna, and in which that was held only a few weeks ago. So at that, many things happened at that meeting, also behind closed doors and in the corridors and between the mayors and so on. It was a very, very important happening. The Minister for Regions, Kozlowska, was there, her head of housing policy was there. So finally we had all these people in a one space together, also talking about, let's move forward, and there's just too much at stake not to. So throughout this process in the background is, of course, the negotiations over the European facility. Do you remember, probably I've watched these things pretty closely, but up until Christmas, we were really, really hoping that the European Council of Ministers would agree on the setting of the 50 billion facility for Ukraine. And it was doubly traumatic because of what was also happening in the US Congress and with the Republicans, and this is real, So we had both these things being held up, and it was really, really distressing. And also we were really concerned that in discussions of the Ukraine plan, which had taken place over the 6 months before, there seems to be an absence of concern about housing in that vision. So it was all about the economy and jobs and etc. But of course, without an adequate home and without an inspiring place to return to, your economy isn't really going to prosper. So we were really trying to encourage the government and the Commission, which is a partner in the plan, to consider housing. And thankfully, they called it human capital formation. And under there, you'll see in the Ukraine plan Reform 7, which is all about access to affordable housing finally. So Reform 7 is about that legal reform, is about general principles. It's also about a new law, completely new law for the establishment of some kind of affordable and social housing, probably something that combines the two, and implementation measures for that, which also consider energy efficiency, and also a big thing for Ukraine is also always about digitalisation. So also what you'll see in there is paragraph on page 129 of the plan, which is about evaluation. So that means, why did the former efforts fail? What have the pilots told us? What can we learn from Ukraine's experience? The donors might want this, but Ukraine's now, had this experience, and this should inform the future. So the reform actions and results are aiming for a new law and an institutional framework that will support affordable rental housing, and that will work in much better partnership with local communities and the displaced households in needs. So this is all nice words, and we've seen nice words being ignored before. So it's really important that observers, academics, NGOs, civil society keep pressure on, and on both the European Commission, which is monitoring the plan and approving the payments for this plan, because it's payment by delivery, payment by progress. So it's really important that that we follow this through and keep the pressure on. So who's responsible? For whom should the pressure be on? So we have the Ministry for the Economy, which is responsible for the whole plan, the Ukraine plan, and we have the Ministry for Communities, Territories, Infrastructure and Development. And in there we have a Deputy Minister responsible for housing policy and a Head of Housing Policy team. Now, keep in mind that these are just people, with limited capacities and limited resources. So if you can help them, rather than just criticise them, all the better. So, through your research, through your networks, through hosting discussions, through forming partnerships, through helping organisations in Ukraine as well to have a voice. If you've got a good pen, to help them communicate, so to do surveys, whatever. But, everybody can influence if they want to, using the capacities they have. So one thing that we'll know, and also we know that is influential, is what kind of investment. And we do see now, after 2 years, the European Investment Bank forming a concept to comply with this plan. So finally, they're in there to play a role. So the design of what they will therefore have quite an influence. So we really need to be engaged with what is the nature of that influence, and definitely watch that space and keep it on track in terms of the original intention. So what could it look like in terms of having a clear vision, reform social housing law, a national agency that works together in partnership with municipalities, a financial intermediary that channels investment to where it's needed, and also more public interest providers in the rental housing system. We would hope that would include produce a more inclusive form of urbanism, so not one which is just about gated communities and private kindergartens and private schools for the lucky few, but one which is part of the broader public wealth and enterprise of society. Healthy places, of course, to grow, create, learn, and age well for the young and the old. So that's primarily my talk, and I'd be really happy if there's any comments or questions or anything if you have. Yeah.
You showed 3 different policy directions for different plans before this, I think, and they were labeled with different costs.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are the differences between them? What are the positives and negatives? It's probably a big question.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Could outline it.
Yeah. I mean, basically, it was a very simple exercise to show if you're going to address the needs of this group, what is the the most cost-effective way to do it for the public purse in a way? Because if there are subsidies involved, how do we reduce them actually, or reduce the need for them? So one of the most effective ways is the way in which municipalities use the land they have. So if they're willing to come in with that to underpin a project, for example, in Denmark, where municipalities make often contribution of leased land, and that gives them nomination rights over a list that they keep of priority needs in their community. So the more that they give in terms of the land resources or the conditions on the leasing, for example, actually the more priority they have in allocating to their community the needs there. So that entices them to do that. So model 1 maximises that component and also some upfront investment. That might mean that it is co-owner, for example, of some of the dwellings. But with that co-ownership, with that role in land provision, or it has also can have positive outcomes in if it's done within the best talents of a good planning system. So that it integrates other ambitions that might be for example, that the first floor are occupied by small, medium-sized businesses and little shops and so on, that it's connected to within 400 metres of a bus stop, that it's includes at one end of the building space for a kindergarten, which might be, so it can do more, much more, if it has a role in that. Nederland is an expert par excellence in those kind of negotiations. So the next model is about you have this idea of efficiency in finance, whereby the financial instrument matches the kind of asset that you've got. And some financial arrangements, are more costly than others. And the use of, for example, instruments like public finance or public loans or guaranteed private investments, those guarantees or publicly backed in some way, that reduces the cost of the investment, and we call that more efficient forms of whatever. So by reducing the size of the loans and the cost of them, that also has an impact on the level of subsidy governments might provide. So the third one is using purely commercial forms of financing in Ukraine, and that's clearly the most expensive. So often you hear the mantra of we've got to have private investment, but actually that might mean, in fact, the costliest outcome for the government. So you see that in some projects, like PFI, private finance initiative projects, they're often involving private finance, but the gap payment is actually a public subsidy, like a rent allowance, very deep one, or an operating allowance to the provider. So they call that PPP availability payment schemes, which offer a sort of guaranteed, revenue payment to the investor. And yeah, they have every deal is different. Everyone takes quite a lot of legal and financial resources to arrange, actually. So they're often customised approaches which make them even more costly. So in some countries, they've, if you like, standardised those arrangements, and they have a role for private investment, a role for those, if you like, subordinated public loans, a role for conditional grants, and they've worked out a sort of systemic approach to the way in which projects are ultimately financed. And they set rents, in fact, which are sufficient to cover the operating costs, which include the financing costs. So the more you can get down those kind of costs without compromising the quality of the dwelling, keeping a decent standard of the dwelling, the better off for the affordability, for the public subsidy needed, and of course, hopefully for the resident. So these cost recovery models, you see them in France, Denmark, Austria is one, and Finland. They all run on that sort of basis, that if you receive public subsidy, you have to operate according to a particular business operating model. So they're not going to subsidise a project only to be taken out, extracted in profits for shareholders, or for windfall profits from there. So it's a way of retaining the public investment and also revolving that, and also not being too much of a burden of it. For example, in Ireland, they've been experimenting with PPP-AP projects, cost rental projects, and municipal housing rent geared to income projects. And they've largely decided that they're going to go for the non-profit cost rental recovery model as their main model for affordable rental housing in Ireland in the future, because the PPP-AP was simply draining the public budget too fast, and they could only do so many thousands of dwellings. So at the end of the day, it's about how many dwellings you can provide to respond to the need, and hopefully that those dwellings aren't here today and gone tomorrow. So it's about, also sustaining the provision of an affordable home for future generations. And that's why in Denmark, for example, their sector of affordable rental housing is actually growing. This one, and it's growing, interestingly, because of its operating model that reinvests whatever surplus that is made at the end of those mortgages being paid off. That tenants keep paying rents, a basic rent, but that accumulates into a national fund, which then goes towards equity towards new projects, which each municipality can initiate. So their affordable rental housing system is growing, it is resilient, and it's being piloted now in Mykolaiv. So the head of the association of these providers, the head of chairperson actually of Housing Europe, and the government of Denmark are piloting that model in Mykolaiv. That was announced only last month. So it's really worth watching how these pilots evolve, how they sit within the municipal culture and settings within Ukraine in a crisis with many other priorities. But there's certainly a lot to be learned from the exchange, and a lot that Ukraine can tell us about how it should be.
One more question. It's amazing how much work you've done together with the initiative group. Could you tell us maybe what are your next steps? What are your plans for the near future? And maybe if something is needed, if you're looking for other experts to join or any other help.
Yeah. Well, you see that we're on the cusp of a decision making about legal structures, which could be quite influential. And we know that the EIB and the European Commission are willing to invest in something. So it will happen, I think, probably end of this year, early next year, there will be maybe an investment, 40,000 dwellings, 4 billion in housing. What housing? What form? For whom? So there's the best I think we can do between now and then is really, really learn about those pilots, understand the situation, and the capacities of municipalities to be able to play a role, because nothing will happen if they don't. So I'm not a betting woman, but I would say that this evaluation of these pilots and learning from the experience of the Nordic Energy Finance Corporation projects, 5 major 20 million projects in 5 cities, we need to learn about them. The IFC has been building public housing in municipalities. Nobody knows about it. We need to understand what's been going on there. The IOM has been bravely trying to make these covenants with these mayors. We need to understand that experience. Communities have been trying to get initiatives off the ground, but they've faced enormous barriers, and we need to know what they are and if they're fair, and what could be done to open more doors. So there's some really great Ukrainian researchers on the ground in Ukraine, and I would dearly love them to be supported to do that evaluation, to go out and talk to the people there, talk to the mayors, talk to the initiators of those projects, those working on legal frameworks for them, to really understand on the ground what's going on. So I think if I had resources, that's where I would be spending it, on understanding how those pilots have fared, and to consolidate that wisdom, and to confront the international organisations with it, the World Bank, the EIB, all them, and to encourage dialogue about how best to create places where people want to live in the way they want to live, and leave no one behind.
Yeah, you discussed the requirement for having energy efficient and spacious and safe buildings. In these initiatives, is the security aspect being discussed, as in building buildings that have modern bomb shelters, or reinforcement of vulnerable aspects?
Yes, yeah. It is being discussed, and about building standards, also about the spatial orientation and space between those buildings and the height of those buildings. And very good work was done by the Coalition of Urban Architects and Researchers, ROSCFIT. Have you heard about ROSCFIT? Yeah. So there's interesting resources actually, and presentations made through ROSCFIT's community about those design aspects. Also, that work was presented again at Geneva at a workshop on housing. Also, who's been facilitating focus on Ukrainian capacity in this area is the New European Bauhaus Initiative. And there have been some presentations, research foci made on typologies of housing and standards of the development. But there's more to it that I could tell you, but it's quite technical. But I think it's worth following up with those resources to know a bit more what's happening. There's also reviews going on of the building code, of the planning law. So there's a lot happening, and a lot of resources needed from really capable and energetic Ukrainian experts, young, forward-thinking people who are, willing to keep an eye on these standards and not let things slip. So yeah, if that's your interest, follow it through, and make sure that those places are rebuilt safely and energy efficiently, and orientated to the sunlight, and with maximum enjoyment for the people, and especially the children that will live there. And there's so many thoughtful practices already from Nederland's past, actually, planning practice that could be drawn on as much as anything. So while you're here, perhaps
what we have here.
yeah, look into critically those efforts as well.
Maybe just a fietsbaan.
Comes a question. You mentioned about a large investment in the housing sector, and how I understood that international World Bank or some other international institution want to invest in Ukraine. But do you believe it really will happen within this year or next year, despite the war?
I think it's already happening in a small scale with these vouchers. You know, the repair, that's definitely happening. And of course, it's amazing for people who go back to Irpin or Bucha and they see actually it's amazing, you know, that buildings are actually being rebuilt and repaired. And also the European Commission has diverted funding for certain things towards the rapid repair of many buildings. So things are happening, but of course the scale is huge. And with regards to large-scale new reconstruction of there is, of course, debates about if there's public investment involved, should it go towards individual homeowners or should it go towards rental housing for future generations? Typically, for example, the EIB itself doesn't invest in home loans. It doesn't invest in home ownership. It invests in affordable rental, affordable green rental now. So it's not going to be a player in rebuilding home ownership dwellings. It will be a player in building affordable rental. In regards to money going towards home ownership, in the plan I noticed an expansion of that home loan program, ARISA, home loan program, which is channeling. Basically, the Ministry of Finance has set up a financial intermediary, which has an agreement with 5 banks, Ukrainian banks. Those banks provide home loans to approved borrowers. I mentioned this program, and they offer loans at 3 and 7%, because the real cost of money is around 16%. So who pays the difference? The Ministry of Finance. So they pay the banks for each loan. You can imagine how much that is. So the subsidy going to those individual homeowners is actually huge for a very small number.
The question is it fair?
No,
for
it's not fair.
Taxpayer?
It's not fair. It's not fair.
Because they don't have money.
It's
right. People's money.
Yeah. So if we were to look at, the right to adequate housing, the human right to adequate housing, it says that every government should try to realise the right to adequate housing, and there are guidelines for that from the UN Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights, which says that should be prioritised according to need. So at the moment, that subsidy is prioritised according to those who can pay for a mortgage. That's different to need. So that's why the General Principles Law, which is being drafted right now and discussed April 3 in Kiev, is saying these general principles will be that the right to adequate housing, governments should realise the right to adequate housing, prioritising need. So that lays into question what one is doing. So interestingly, when we were in Vienna, we had the chairperson of that financial intermediary and also of another one, which was focused mainly on youth housing finance for young families. And they were both asked, what will you do for investing in affordable rental for those who are not willing to commit to a mortgage or not able to commit for a mortgage? And their initial response from the Ministry of Finance side was, we don't know that business, it's foreign. We don't know how to do that. So now the question is, okay, you don't know it. Which one of you is willing to learn that business? Where you might be investing in an entity instead of in an individual household. So one of the two said, we will do that. So now the question will be, has that entity really got the capacity to change and to encompass that? And I can give you an example of a national entity which does just that. So in 2018, after 5 years of research and lobbying and advocacy, the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation was established in Australia in 2018. It's now called Housing Australia, and that does both support affordable first-home buyers, the housing for them, but primarily supports a public interest rental sector. So regulated entities able to receive favourable loans and support from municipalities to provide affordable rental housing for future generations. So it's not just here today and gone tomorrow, but it's there for the long term. So it does both, but it prioritises the segments that need the most assistance. And it's now called Housing Australia. It does a State of the Nation report. It participates in public discussions about the future of housing policy. It sponsors research. It's not best, could be better, and hopefully it's the model perhaps the Ukraine can take on, a better version of that. Don't know. We have to wrap up. Does anybody have one last question from the back?
I'm not sure how long my question can be, but all of these finances that are going to be pouring into Ukraine after or during the war, what really will make a difference in my view is the level of good governance that can be set up in place. And considering that there is a lot of trust that is going to be also put on the current and the future political field within Ukraine, are there any mechanisms from foreign investors or foreign organizations to monitor how good governance within Ukraine? Is there any way to monitor how the money are being spent, essentially?
Yeah, and actually, in that Ukraine plan, that's one of the lines about setting up such a monitoring mechanism. And there are best practices around in the housing sector, which we could learn something from. They can't be cut and paste at all, but they could inspire thinking about what type of specialised accounting, auditing, reporting for those receiving public subsidies would be expected to deliver, and how will those reports be not only done, by somebody spending 3 weeks in the organisation not receiving any money for that, but who would do that? Who would report on that? For example, would they report to the funding body that funds them? And if they didn't perform well, then they would not receive ongoing favourable support. So let's think who does that. So the Austrians do it as a club. That's one way. The Finnish do it as a special service. They come and visit. It's a part of the national agency. The Scottish do it as a independent, but with a few others, some academics and some households, to peer review. Well, in my housing association, it works really well, and someone looks after the garden, and it's nice and tidy. And this one, it's neglected. No one listens to me. So they also have peer review of households involved as well in Scotland, and they go further. They have cities competing against each other to have the most beautiful homes. So you can do regulation in all kinds of ways. Money talks, peer review, advocacy, emancipating the people who live there. So there are all ways that we could build into a better system. Think how you would want to live, what say you would want to have, what power you would need to make a change in the environment where you were living. If your landlord was ripping you off or not replacing, or places was running down. So what would you need to be able to ensure you had a good place to live? And not be terrorised by who knows, some your neighbours even. So there are different ways, and again, people need to learn about their options in the policy space, inform the discussion, and lift the realm of imagination for what could be.